How's it going? So welcome. This is the inaugural Bible study. So here's what I have. I actually have my iPad right here just to help me do this, and then another one. But out of a recent question I posted on Facebook and on Instagram, if anyone would be interested in going through a book of the Bible. And there was a lot of responses. I want to say there's probably like 25 or 30, which is pretty good for just people willing to check it out, right? Just to give a reply. But there were so many references or so many suggestions of different books of the Bible. And a lot of them had one-off references, but John's Gospel was the one that seemed to have the most people respond to it. And so we'll do this. Let's go through the Gospel of John bit by bit. So every couple days, I'll see if I can do this, and I will schedule a live stream. And what will happen is it will save it online. And so even if you aren't here for the first time, that's okay. Or if you aren't checking it out live, that's fine. You can look it up later. But my thought was this. I'm going to read through a section of John at a time and then give commentary on it. All right. So really fast, let me just say, my undergrad is in biblical studies. I have a master's of divinity, and I'm wrapping up a master's of theology at Princeton. And John's Gospel is one of my favorite ones, not just because I share the same name, but because John's Gospel is misunderstood, I think. And going all the way back to undergrad, I had a professor that asked the question. And I think this is the angle that we'll take, because most people read John's Gospel like it's a strict biography, which is fine. And it does something really interesting. It tends to look at how God became man, whereas the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke talk about how this man was God. And so you've got this difference of perspective that's happening. But scholars think that it was written somewhere around the year 90-ish, which is roughly the same time as when the book of Revelation was written. And if it was written by the same person, Raymond Brown, who's a New Testament scholar, asked the question, what if John's Gospel is just as symbolic and loaded with meaning as the book of Revelation, which is often misunderstood, right? So it's going to be fascinating because I think I'm going to take that angle. And you might have a different approach. You might think of reading John's Gospel as though it's in a different genre, but this is going to be what's known as a rather allegorical, or the early church just called it a spiritual way of reading it. So let's see if we can do that. Okay. I think we're good to go. You ready? So John's Gospel starts off with 18 verses that are very profound. They're very deep, but they're kind of supposed to be seen as like it's a prologue, so it's before the beginning of the words that are the rest of John's Gospel. It sets certain things up that happen later on in the gospel. So you may not realize it, but when we go through this passage, I'm going to make reference to some things that are going to have their payoff later down the road. And when you start to understand the rest of the gospel in light of and informed by the prologue, it starts to unlock, and it just like blooms and it blossoms, and it's really quite profound to even imagine. So I'm going to read through it, just the first 18 verses, and we'll comment on parts of it along the way. So let's do this, all right? I have here two English versions and the Greek version, and then I actually have N.T. Wright's and Michael Bird's New Testament in Its World. It's a pretty good book. Of course, my journal, just as always, but I set the camera up right there so that you can feel like we're just seated at the same table and chatting through it. So hopefully it's got a little bit of a personal feel. All right. So let me take a swig of orange sparkling water. Hold on. But thank you. Let's do this. John 1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being, in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it." Pause. Let's stop there. So you might have noticed right off the start, John's Gospel's got echoes of Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, is what Genesis starts with. And John's Gospel is already making connections to the first book of the Bible by saying, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We already have John doing some really fancy things, saying that the Word was at the beginning, was next to God, but also was God. So we actually have the start of a Trinitarian reading of John's Gospel. But you might ask, like, what does this mean? The Word with a capital W. Well, in Greek reading and philosophy, they would say word or logos is also where we get the word logic. It's the word for word, but it's also the word for logic. It's also the word for reason. I even like to give it the playful interpretation of even blueprint. In the beginning was the blueprint. John's Gospel is trying to say that Jesus is the logic of God, the reason of God, the blueprint of God by which all things have been made. You see, now we're getting somewhere. But in verse 5, it says, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it." The Greek word for overcome there, it not just means overcome, it also means to understand. So not only did the darkness not overcome the light, which would be in Genesis when God says, "Let there be light," and all of a sudden the darkness pushes back as light exists. The darkness did not overcome the light, but also the darkness did not understand the light. And I think that's one of those instances where in the prologue, it's setting up things that will happen throughout the rest of the gospel. And we'll actually even see that payoff happening right away in John chapter 2, 3, and even 4 right off the bat. And further on down the road, right? But when we talk about what has come into being, in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. There's a lot of talk in John's Gospel where he uses like archetypal language of light and life and darkness, and these are kind of timeless vocabulary for good and evil, and for light and darkness, and for chaos and order, and all of these things. John's Gospel is very much steeped in Greek tradition or vocabulary, but is using that vocabulary to understand the life of Jesus. But if you haven't noticed, John's Gospel hasn't even said the name Jesus yet. So let's go to verse 6. "There was a man sent from God," okay, "whose name was John," not me. "He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light." So we're already having inferences of John the Baptist as having a very important role, and his role is just to point towards something and someone greater than himself. Now, in John's Gospel, we've got something that happens throughout the entire narrative, but it rises as it goes through. John's Gospel is going to have what's known as escalating testimonies. that as the gospel goes along, there's going to be titles that are going to be given to the person of Jesus. And each time, in each chapter, it's going to give a new title to Jesus that's a little higher, and a little higher, and a little higher, and a little higher. So John's gospel is really orchestrated and written brilliantly. There's payoff that's going to come about, but there's also this rise that keeps going in reference to Jesus. It's going to culminate with, guess who? Doubting Thomas. Yeah, he's going to have the highest title. Well, he gives the highest title in all of John's gospel to the person of Jesus. Verse 9, we're halfway through this, okay. The true light. Oh man, see, John's gospel is already doing it. True light, not a false light. The true light, with which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. Do you not hear the references back to Genesis of like, God said, let there be light, and it illuminates everything? Yeah. Verse 10. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. Jesus was the blueprint that was not recognized. He was the reason and the logic of God that was not noticed by the people that were actually dependent on him being the logic and the reason and the blueprint. Oh, this is such good stuff. Okay. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. There's this brilliant push-pull and conflict that Jesus came for people that didn't want him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. The phrase children of God is going to show up all throughout John's gospel. And in fact, it has the phrase being used far more than Matthew does, than Mark does, or Luke does. John's gospel has got not only payoffs that will happen, not just rising testimonies of Jesus, but it's even going to have its own favorite phrases that it will use over and over and over and over. And so it's really important to pay attention whenever there's repetition. You feel me? Verse 14. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Pause. When the Word became flesh, we have right there one of the most profound things ever mentioned. We understand this is contrary to Greek Platonism. So Greek Platonism, from Plato and Plato's cave, said that the material world was less important, or was a shadow of what's more important, the spiritual realm or things. And they're usually seen as against each other. They're seen in opposition. But here, like I said, we have God becoming man. And so when we say the Word became flesh, we're saying the reason, the logic, the blueprint of God is now taking on material existence itself. Now we're starting to challenge the normal Greek understanding of things with what is more understood as a Christian mode of seeing things. And this is a reference towards the incarnation. Now there's one thing you need to pay attention to. When it says that he came and lived among us, the real wording could also say he came and tented among us, or tabernacled. It's supposed to be a reference back towards the Old Testament, where the Israelites are wandering in the desert and they have their own tabernacle, a transportable worship tent. Well, here's John's gospel making some connections, not just to Genesis, but also to the stories of Exodus, saying, oh, this God who's been around all the while, yeah, the Word and the light of the world is here, and is tenting among us. There's something very deep, because just like I said, there's Greek Platonism, which kept material and spiritual as opposites to each other. But there's also this understanding that the Greek gods are so far off, and maybe they're off on Mount Olympus, and they're disinvolved with the human life. Well, here is a deity that leaves the throne of heaven to live in a tent just because he wants to be close to the people. What's going on there? Because that's a huge amount of humility that makes this story even more profound. John's gospel is setting up major things. Let's keep going. Verse 15. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks ahead of me because he was before me.' From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." And that ends the prologue of John's gospel. Now, we'll say a few last things right here. When it says, when John says that this was he of whom I said, "He who comes after me ranks ahead of me because he was before me," John the Baptist is setting up the primacy of Jesus as being very, very important, because Jesus, even in John the Baptist's understanding, pre-exists him. Now, we got some crazy stuff going on there. We also have references that from Jesus we have already received grace upon grace upon grace upon grace, because it is the logic, the reason, the blueprint of God to give grace upon grace upon grace upon grace before even the advent of Jesus in our lives. Now, earlier in the prologue, it also says that in him was full grace and truth. John's gospel is going to go back and forth between those two things. This is another instance of something that's going to have payoff throughout the entire gospel, is that Jesus is always being presented whenever he's relating to people throughout this gospel. He's going to be given the opportunity to be gracious but not be truthful, or be truthful and not be gracious. Because we have the tendency of doing that. Sometimes we can give in to being so graceful with other people that we forget to say the truth of the moment. Or sometimes we are so truthful that sometimes we feel beholden to that we forget to give grace. Well, Jesus, as he encounters different people throughout the chapters of this book, he always navigates both grace and truth with every person that he meets. Doesn't lean on one or the other more, but somehow does both 100%. Now that's fascinating, right? Okay, last up. The law indeed was given through Moses. So here is John's gospel connecting and even validating the law of Moses as being vital, as important. It is the code by which all faithful Israelites or people that follow Yahweh would live by. However, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. This verse, verse 17, just double checking. It takes until verse 17 before John even brings up the name Jesus. Everything that comes before this, the first 16 verses, are references towards Jesus being the Word, or the light, or life. There's references of grace and truth. So we have a lot of things going on here that are connecting before we even say the name of Jesus. And lastly, no one has ever seen God is a common statement among faithful Judaism. Not only that, but it is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known. This is a roundabout kind of poetic way of saying that it is by Jesus that we come to see God. Martin Luther, I think he said that God is actually most revealed through Jesus on the cross, not through any other moment. And so what we have within the Christian religion is actually the opposite of religion. Religion is a man-made system by which to try to understand experiences of the divine, the infinite, the incomprehensible, the things of which are beyond our conception. That's religion. And that's still kind of like a grasping up towards trying to understand or hold God. But revelation is supposedly different, because it's not a man-made system trying to understand or put words to experiences of God. Instead, it's God saying, you don't have to guess anymore. I'll show you what I am. Now notice I said, I'll show you what I am, not what I'm like. There was long debates in the early church. Does Jesus show us what God is, or does Jesus show us what God is like? And John's gospel is the reason why we say Jesus shows us what God is, or who God is, or who God has always been, who God will always be. And so Jesus actually comes into the narrative right here in John's gospel to dispel every false understanding of what the Father is supposed to be. Now, we have a beautiful thing right there. What was that, verse? Yeah. What we have here is the end of the prologue, though. We are going to do this every so often. I'm going to try to set the camera up just the same. And we're going to read through different parts. Next up, we're going to read the testimony of John the Baptist, starting at verse 19. And then we'll keep going. And I think maybe we'll do not exactly one full chapter each video. Sometimes it's good to just cut it as it is and do it in parts. I'll make more episodes and they'll seem more digestible. But this was John's gospel, or at least the prologue. And let me tell you, there's a few things just to recap. The prologue here has set up some payoffs that will be further on down the road. It already has the start of some rising testimonies or titles that would be given to Jesus. It sets up the dualism that Jesus is going to relate to people with full grace and full truth, neither one and not the other, but instead always do both. But then also we have the setup that Jesus is going to be showing us, the reader, what God is, or who God is, not just who God is like. Because it's not a matter of likeness, it's actually a full equation. Because if you remember at the very beginning, I said John's gospel is about how showing this God became man as a revelation, whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke prefer to talk about how this man was God. So it's important to read Matthew, Mark, and Luke in contrast with John because it's such a different angle. And of course, as I said before, we're going to read this in a very allegorical, so we're going to use allegory, a very spiritual reading, and we're even going to try to decode John's gospel a little bit in the style of Raymond Brown, this New Testament scholar, who says that maybe we can read this a little bit like the book of Revelation, with a lot of coded messages in it. And that'll make it fun. It'll make it into a puzzle to always dig deeper into. All right. So I hope you enjoyed. This was the first one. We'll see how it goes. And yeah, this is going to sound a little corny, but hit subscribe. And of course, give a shout out. So it's all good. We'll catch you later. Yeah. Be well. Grace and peace.